Here's a three-for-all on a handful of albums from notable artists, but all three of these albums, while they exhibit it in different ways, all have a similar theme behind them. They're all really boring. I mean, some are definitely more so than others, and I'd say each one of these is boring in a unique and different kind of way, but given the acumen that all three of these groups usually carry with them, I'm surprised that all three of them presented me with albums that frankly don't give me much to talk about, and none more so than the latest Bullet For My Valentine. Oh, this one's been getting a lot of buzz lately, and by buzz, I of course mean because they went and did the same damn thing so many other rock artists are trying to do in 2018, mainly just make a trap record and hope they get away with it. And they didn't. Of course they didn't. How many more shitty, neutered, musically strangled, atmospheric experiments are we going to get before all of you realize this is a bad idea and it should be canned? Look, people, this is a fad. A plain and simple fad, and oh my god, the quicker it dies off, the better. But it doesn't really surprise me that Bullet For My Valentine went with it. Full disclosure, I've never been all that huge on Bullets. I liked some of the cuts from stuff like The Poison and Scream, Aim, and Fire from back in the day, but I don't know, they never seemed worth a stan or anything, partly because they never really felt all that original. I mean, The Poison, for all its good parts, was basically just following the trend of gothy screamo that was big at the time, and Scream, Aim, and Fire seemed to be hopping on that same melodic metalcore train that was chugging through the station not long after. From my perspective, these guys always seem to be trend chasers, at least of a sort. Hell, if anything, I'm wondering what took them so long. I almost want a really weird trend to pop back up in the rock world for a while, something like a ska revival or a polka renaissance, so we can get a BFMV album with like accordions and shit. Wouldn't that be wild? But hey, you know, credit where it's due, even if they weren't always the most original band in the world, they were at least capable of cranking out a few good tunes every now and then. Say what you want about them, but stuff like Tears Don't Fall, Scream, Aim, and Fire, oh, those were outright bangers. This album though? Blech. Yeah, people are shouting really angrily about this one, but people, I'm sorry, they're right too. This thing is just a thick, hazy miasma of nothingness. It has the same problem that a lot of albums that succumb to this trend always seem to have. The instrumentation is heavily restrained, the production is way too clean and sterile, and the lofty atmospheric synths are implemented in ways that somehow prevent the music from feeling lofty and atmospheric. God, even when these guys fuck up, they can't be original about it, can they? Ugh. But even though this is another unfortunate victim claimed by a beast I've begun calling the Imagine Dragon, I just, can't get worked up about it, at least not in the same way that other people are. I don't know if it's just gimmick fatigue, I don't know if it's because I'm just not as into this band as other people are, but I just can't get worked up over it at all. It leaves so little impression on you. The moment I knew this album was gonna fail for me was when I booted it up on Spotify and accidentally neglected to realize through my first listen that I had the album on shuffle. I played the whole thing out of order on my first listen and barely even noticed it. And when I went through it a second time properly, yeah, there was literally next to no difference. It's all so toothless and uninspired. Unlike some of the other victims caught between the Imagine Dragon's jaws, these guys were still able to maintain some distortion on their guitars and their fleeting moments of heaviness and intensity here and there. But man, it's not nearly enough to save it, and everything else is so featureless and gray. I couldn't name you a single track from this album, even if I tried. This album is just a bag of M&Ms. When you open the bag, it's just full of different colors meeting your eye, but in your mouth, everything tastes the same. And this shit doesn't even go well with popcorn, so what's even the point? Gravity gets 2 much better gravities out of 5. Well, okay, I didn't have any expectations for Bullet For My Valentine, so it being a disappointment is, no big deal, right? Panic at the Disco, on the other hand, this one kind of stings a wee bit. I loved Death of a Bachelor. It was one of my top albums of the year in 2016, and man, it still holds up pretty well, I'd say. Brendan Urie finally came into his own as a solo artist and presented us with the kind of dynamic songcrafting skills and blistering performances that help cement an artist as a positive force. Ever since the band went through their first major shakeup after Pretty Odd, I've always been super ho-hummy on just how much of a future Panic was going to have as a project, but Death of a Bachelor, that was the album that finally nailed it for me. That album told me that even as a glorified Brendan Urie side project, there was still plenty of potential to tap from the Panic at the Disco well. Bit of a shame we didn't see too much of that potential being tapped here. Again, this is like kind of the worst kind of album to review, in that I don't hate it, I don't love it, it just kind of sits there on my chest and doesn't do much. And I think a big part of that is just the music itself. Urie's leaned a bit heavier into the electronica bent on this one. A lot more electronic drum work, way more squelch and treble in the keyboards, and more absence of the traditional guitar, bass, and drums dynamic. It's a much poppier record, even by those Panic at the Disco standards. Though, I mean, that's kind of par for the course for Panic at the Disco. I mean, they've been moving in this direction for years now, and here we finally are at something that is basically just full-blown pop, but I don't know, it just doesn't gel as well as it did on previous albums. This isn't quite a Paramore transition into poppiness, it's just, I don't know. I mean, there's still some bright spots here. Fuck a Silver Lining and Say Amen Saturday Night do a good job of getting you hooked in, but those are the first 2 songs on this album, and man, once it gets going, it starts losing steam really fast. All the overstuffed instrumentation and the overly pristine production just makes the polish of the music overwhelm its actual substance. Yeah, it's shiny, but it shines so damn bright you can't actually see anything. And that kind of defeats the purpose of polishing something, doesn't it? And Brendan is just starting to mildly touch into a few bad habits here on this record. Just a bit. Don't think I didn't notice that chipmunk vocal bullshit on tracks like Dancing's Not a Crime and One of the Drunks. In fact, it feels like Urie was using a lot more vocal modulations and other pitch shifting techniques and other vocal fuckery for certain tracks, which, dude, come on, you're Brendan fucking Urie. You are the last son of a bitch who should be pulling a T-Pain. He also really seems to be losing touch with his sense of scale and dynamics on this album. Like, I think his goal here was, since The Emperor's New Clothes was such a big hit, let's just make the album nothing but The Emperor's New Clothes. Ha 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 ha! Every song goes big. Every song goes for broke. And yeah, I'm usually the motherfucker encouraging an artist to do that, I understand. But here it leaves the album feeling, well, like Gravity, kind of interchangeable. Once you've heard 1 or 2 tracks from this album, you've basically heard the whole thing. Outside of another sort of mellow closer in Dying in LA, every song on this album just sounds too much like itself. While not to the extent of Gravity, I'd say. I mean, despite this album's feelings of sameness, Brendan is still absolutely killer from a raw execution standpoint, but this album doesn't have enough mix-ups or deviations or cool different things about it to help the tracks stick out from each other. Again, topping Death of a Bachelor is no easy task, but this album really could have used a bit more variety, in my opinion. Your mileage might vary more with this one, I guess, depending on your taste for overproduced pop music, but I don't know, I have trouble seeing this as many people's favorite Panic record. I was just not feeling this. Pray for the Wicked gets 3 song titles with unnecessary parentheses out of 5. But okay, Gorillaz. Gorillaz has to impress, right? Gorillaz is a goddamn mythical band that can do no wrong. That's gotta be the album that saves this episode, right? For one, were you here for my review of Humans? That whole Gorillaz is flawless narrative got a whole lot of holes shot through it last year. Look, Humans was by no means a terrible album, but I think even most diehard fans can admit it was polarizing. It just wasn't everyone's cup of tea. And sadly, I was one of those people who ordered a coffee after having a sip of it. It just felt so not Gorillaz. There were way too many features on it. Like, even though a fair amount of them were good features that did bring a lot to the table, it was just so damn much, it kind of suffocated that album. And it had this sour, moody, depressing as balls proto-concept that kneecapped the tone and made it way more of a slog than it really had to be. I mean, 2017 was already a depressing year. We really could have done without Gorillaz, of all people, adding to the misery. But now, just barely a year after that album, we have the Now Now. God, what is it with Gorillaz albums? They either take way, way, way too long to get here, or they sneak up on you and surprise you. The hell is up with that? And this album, wow, this almost feels like a straight up apology for Humans. This thing is way more stripped back, way more toned down, and there's only 2 songs here with features on them, and I'm almost positive one of them is just because Snoop Dogg is obligated by law to be a feature in at least 60% of all American music, and he's just filling his quota. If the lack of Damon Albarn's vocals on the last album didn't rub you the right way, then this is gonna be the album for you. My God, it's all 2D all the time on this thing. And you know, I'm all about that. This is definitely more of a straightforward, no frills kind of Gorillaz release. There's not a lot of experimentation with other genres like there was on Humans, you know, all that gospel, soul music, jazz stuff. Nah, none of that's really here. It's more of a smooth, mild, deep electronica kind of vibe. It's a much more mellow outing than Humans was. I could argue this is probably one of the most chill Gorillaz albums we've ever gotten. It's very melody focused, and the melodies are very soothing and relaxed overall. It has a wonderful flow and a gentle vibrancy to it that makes it a rather infectious listen, I do have to admit. Even though it's not an entirely prominent one. See, I did state at the top of this video that all the albums we're discussing had a similar problem of being a touch on the boring side. Well, this one, I can say for sure, is the least boring of the 3, but that doesn't mean it isn't a touch snoozy. Again, it shares the same problem in that a lot of the tracks on this thing just blend into one another. It's hard to pick out too many standout songs, too many single cuts, you know, stuff that's gonna win you over from note 1. Every song on this album is a bit indistinguishable from a lot of the others. But on this record, I feel like that sort of hazy vibe just works better. I mean, the tracks ebb and flow into each other a lot more gracefully, given that this album has more of a soothing and relaxing overall kind of theme and tone. It just feels a bit more appropriate here, and taken as a whole, I actually kind of enjoy this one. This was a great album to, you know, put on in the background while I was doing other stuff and not focusing in on it too intensely. But again, like, you can see how that can be a bit of a problem. This kind of music, isn't usually what I come to Gorillaz for. When I think of Gorillaz, I'm usually thinking Demon Days, not, you know, explosions in the sky. It does work, but not on the same level you'd expect a Gorillaz album to work. I'm starting to wonder if we'll ever recapture the glory days of their early albums ever again. And while I do enjoy this album more than I did Humans, it still kinda doesn't stick out enough for me to full-blown love it. It's just not interesting enough for me to lose my nuggets over, man. I mean, despite Humans' flaws, you can't argue that album wasn't ambitious as all hell. This does not have that same level of ambition. If anything, I'd say it feels rushed. Humans had plenty of strong ups and downs. This album just kinda hovers in a comfortable middle. It does a lot of things well, but not enough to really dazzle. It's an album that certainly is there. The Now Now gets 3.5 memes out of 5.
Guten Abend.